In yesterday's video, we talked a little bit about Magnus Carlsen's bio, and we also looked at Magnus playing from the white side against Ian Nepomniachtchi. Now let's look at Jan playing from the white side. Talk a little bit about Jan. So Jan was born in 1990. He's 31 years old, and in 2007, he earned his Grandmaster title. And he's kind of bounced around somewhere around 10th in the world for quite a while, until very recently he made a surge. And in the 2020/2021 candidates tournament, he had a very impressive 8.5 out of 14 to win the event with a 28.49 performance rating. And what's interesting about that performance rating is that's at the level that Magnus consistently plays at. So Jan has proven with that event, with the top players in the world and their best preparation, it's the biggest tournament outside of the World Championship. He's proven in that event that he can play at the same level as Magnus, 28.50 performance rating. Jan is currently the world number 5 player, and he has a classical head-to-head score of 4-1 against Carlsen, 4 wins to 1 win, with 8 draws. And that's a huge margin, a +3 score against Magnus, and really no other top players in the world can claim that type of score against Magnus. In Magnus's defense, 3 of those games are quite a bit older when the players were both juniors, but still there's some psychology to that. Another interesting thing about Jan is he's a top player at Blitz and Rapid. And if you look at the last 2 matches that Carlsen had, he really wasn't afraid of his opponents, Karyakin and Caruana, in the Rapid. And I think he actually was fine with having matches that went into the Rapid, because the thing with Magnus is he gets a larger advantage over his opponents as the time controls get faster, and he knows that. So he was okay drawing the classical portions with Caruana because he knew that he could outplay him in the Rapid, and same thing against Karyakin. But with Nepomniachtchi, the interesting thing is they don't have as many draws as Carlsen does against the other top players. And there's a lot of wins back and forth, and I think it's a risky strategy for Carlsen to take it into the rapid tiebreak. So now let's go through the last 16 games and just talk about the opening strategy, and then we'll look at sort of the psychology of what they should play in the World Championship match, and I'll kind of give some recommendations with what I think each player should play in the match and maybe some things that we could expect. So we're going to start with a game all the way back in September of 2020. So a lot of these games that they've played recently have been online. A lot of them are Blitz or Rapid, but I think since the pandemic, these top players have been showing some of their better prep in the online events because there hasn't been any OTB events, and there's been some significant prizes in these online events. So for once, the online events actually have mattered. So this is going back 16 games, and this was the St. Louis Blitz tournament, which was played on Lee Chess. And in this game, we'll see Nepomniachtchi actually pulls out the Nimzo Larsen opening. And he has a really smooth win in this game. This is kind of like textbook Nimzo Larsen strategy, and he's able to outplay Magnus. So right around this point, the position's equal. And starting here, Jan gets an advantage, and he outplays Magnus to get the win and beats him in the endgame. And the interesting thing with this is Jan outplays Magnus in multiple endgames. And one of the strengths that Magnus has playing these other top players in the world is he tends to outplay them in the endgame. Not always the case with Jan. Jan gets a lot of endgame wins himself. So that's going to be very interesting as well. So it's not like Magnus can just outplay him in these equal positions. Jan can do the same thing back to Magnus. So this was a B3 Nimzo Larsen, won by Jan. And keep this in mind, because we'll come back to 1B3 later. All right, then moving on. This is the Skilling Open. It's a rapid event played on Chess24. And here we see a closed Roy Lopez. And one thing to note about Jan is he almost exclusively plays E4 against Magnus. 15 out of the 16 games we're going to look at, Jan plays 1 E4. And in this game, we see that Jan puts the knight on C3. That's also something he does quite often in these Roy Lopez games. So they don't get kind of the typical Ruy Lopez structure. And in this game, Jan was able to get the win, but it was a very up and down game. So here, white has a big advantage. Going towards the middle game, things were closer to equal. And at the very end, there was a blunder right here. And I think that was probably a mouse slip even. So you could claim that Carlsen maybe had the win here if he didn't mouse slip with queen to b5 check. That would have been really strong. So that was a win by Jan, but I think you could claim that because it was an up and down game, that really it could have gone either way, and maybe Magnus did deserve the win in that one. So that was the first game where Jan played e4 against him that we're going to look at. And then next game, also from the Skilling Open, Magnus plays Sicilian. And we see a Sicilian dragon. And in this one, Jan had endgame chances to win. So if we fast forward to this endgame, this is an advantage for white. And right around here, the engine says Magnus made a blunder. And I think Jan could have won this game. We're looking at a +4 or +5 engine eval. And right there, Jan made a mistake. If he plays king to e4, the engine thinks that this is winning right now. So Jan missed a win against the Sicilian dragon. And one thing we'll note going forward is Carlsen switches up his Sicilian repertoire. So we're not going to see Sicilian dragon, I don't think, anytime soon from Magnus. All right, in the next game, also from the Skilling Open, now we see Magnus go back to e5 after e4. And here he decides to play a Berlin. And this game was a very even game throughout. So typical of the Berlin, there's a lot of drawish, dry lines. Magnus was able to comfortably hold this game. And actually, you could maybe even claim that he was pressing for a small advantage here in the endgame with the bishop against knight. But very easy draw for Magnus in the Berlin. In the next game, also from the Skilling Open, we see e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, Ruy Lopez. But now Magnus goes back to a6. And this turns into a closed Ruy Lopez. It was a very even game throughout. And if we fast forward to the end, this is a dead equal position according to Stockfish. Jan outplays Magnus in this endgame. So if you look at these very dynamic positions, this is where Jan can outplay Magnus. And he can outplay Magnus in faster time controls too, which is like unheard of at the top level. Usually Magnus just blows people off the board in blitz, and he's really good in rapid as well. Now moving on to the next game, this is also the Skilling Open. This one turns out to be a draw, and it's a very equal game throughout, also a closed Ruy Lopez. And this is more of a traditional setup, but again we do see Jan puts the knight on c3, he doesn't play pawn to c3. And engine's saying 0.0 in a lot of these positions. But one thing that's kind of nice to note is that these players do still keep it exciting. So even though this is 0.00, from a human perspective, there's a lot of dynamics in this position. So both of these players play fighting chess, but this one was an even game throughout. So if we recap the 4 Ruy Lopez games so far, 2 of them were wins for Jan and 2 were draws. That's a pretty good result in 4 games against Magnus. So now in the next event that they play, the Air Things Masters event on Chess24, it's a rapid tournament. Magnus comes back with the Sicilian, but now he unleashes the Sveshnikov. And this is his specialty now. This is something that he played against Caruana, and this is something that there's a chessable repertoire on, the Magnus Sicilian. Very good repertoire course. I own it and I used to study it. I think the Sveshnikov is going to be a very solid weapon for Magnus if Jan goes e4. And this was a very even game throughout. And actually they ended up agreeing to a draw pretty quickly into the game. Already on move 24 they agreed to the draw. The next event is the Opera Euro Rapid event played on Chess24. This was in July of this year, so not too long ago. And we see e5 again by Magnus. And they go back to a closed Ruy Lopez. And again, we see Jan playing one of these lines with knight to c3, not pawn to c3. And here in this game, Jan did have some chances in the middle game to win. So here we see some weaknesses around Magnus's king. Jan has bishops that are well placed, the knights are well placed for a kingside attack. Stockfish is saying over a 1-point advantage here for Jan. Magnus was able to draw this game. Sorry, that last game was in February of 2021, February 7th. Now moving to March 2021, we have the Carlsen Invitational. This was a rapid event played on Chess24. And here, Carlsen goes back to his Sveshnikov, and he gets a very smooth win in this game. And I think this is something that Jan's going to want to avoid. I don't think he wants to play against Carlsen's Sveshnikov. Carlsen is so well prepped for this. And let's fast forward a bit and show you the endgame. This position is close to equal, but Magnus completely outplays Nepomniachtchi here. Yeah, this was actually the big blunder. Bishop takes c4, but I think Jan was feeling the pressure. His pieces are all kind of trapped, and the initiative is in Magnus's court. Magnus outplays him for the win in the Sveshnikov. So looking at the Sveshnikov game so far, we had one even game throughout that ended up in a draw, and now we have a win by Magnus that was super smooth. So that's something to keep in mind. I think the e4, e5 openings have gone pretty well for Jan so far, but the Sveshnikov, Jan hasn't posed any problems to Magnus. Alright, now moving to the next game, also from the Carlsen Invitational. Here we see e4, e5, they go into a Ruy Lopez. And now we get an open Ruy Lopez for the first time. So we've seen 4 closed Ruy Lopez games, and now we see an open Ruy Lopez. And in this one, it was an even game throughout, and they agreed to a pretty quick draw, 20 moves in. So I think that's a plus for Magnus, being able to get a 20-move draw, switching to the open Ruy Lopez. In the next game from the same event, Magnus goes back to the Sicilian, but he surprises Jan, I think, by playing d6, and he's not going for his Sveshnikov, he's not going for the dragon, and here Jan plays bishop to b5 check, the Moscow variation. This did not pose any problems for Magnus, and Magnus actually had an advantage, small advantage in most of this game. So I think if either side was going to win, it was Magnus, but it was pretty close to equal throughout. But you will note there was some dynamic imbalances in this game as well. So not too many boring draws again between these players. Moving on to the next game from the Carlsen Invitational. Now we see a Ruy Lopez, and this one is an offbeat variation with this kind of early knight d5, the knights trade off in b4. So there's a lot of symmetry going on here. This looks like it would be a pretty even game, and that's how it turned out. So really neither side was able to create anything. Very drawish game all the way through, and they ended up playing 62 moves and got into this queen and pawn endgame, which is a dead draw. Now moving on to the second to last game from the Carlsen Invitational. Here we see a Sicilian with e6. So Magnus has thrown a bunch of different Sicilians at Jan. And I don't know if there's some psychology behind this. Maybe Magnus is trying to test Jan, because Jan just says e4, e4, e4 every single time they play. And Carlsen's saying, all right, I'm going to try e5, I'm going to try c5, but not only just c5, I'm going to throw different Sicilians at you, sometimes Berlin, sometimes classical Ruy Lopez. So it seems like Jan is sticking to his guns for the most part. Magnus is throwing different things at Jan to see what he plays. And in this game, after e6, we see an early queen to b6. This is not a very strong line according to the engine. Stockfish says white's up like 0.9 or maybe 1.0. But the thing is, you have to know your theory, and it's a bit of an offbeat line. So the game was pretty close to equal all the way through the middle game. But then when we reached the end game, we got this interesting imbalance, passed pawns against the bishop, and Magnus was able to outplay Jan in this game. So very nice outplay in the end game, And this was the final position where Jan resigned. Now we'll move to the last game from the Carlsen Invitational, another rapid game. Here we see e4, e5. They go for a Ruy Lopez. And again, it's an offbeat line. We see this early knight to d5. But in this game, I think Magnus was a bit more prepared for it because Magnus actually had some slight advantages in this game. So I'm just kind of jumping around. You know, a lot of these positions, Stockfish is saying maybe Magnus is up about half of a pawn. So I don't think Jan got anything out of this game that he wanted. It actually went for 142 moves, and they ended up drawing in this odd rook versus knight endgame. Yeah, so it was rook and knight against rook. Magnus had the extra knight. And then somehow Magnus blundered his rook. This must have been an online mouse slip. Oh yeah, he put the rook on the wrong square. So Magnus was outplaying Jan in this game. Jan didn't really get anything out of this offbeat Ruy Lopez. So the offbeat Ruy, Magnus has done well against Jan. The Sicilian, Magnus has done even better against Jan, I think. So if Jan plays 1e4, I think he's got to expect the Sicilian in this match. But we got 2 more games to look at. Now we'll look at a Norway chess game. This was in September of 2021, September of this year. And we see e4, e5, an early knight c3, and Jan plays the Vienna. So he's going for something a little bit different, not the typical Ruy Lopez. And this is an Armageddon game, meaning a draw is a win for black. So Jan has to press extra hard. And in this game it was pretty equal, and I think it's because Jan had to press hard that Magnus was able to get the win. Jan had to take too many chances to avoid the draw, and Magnus got a pretty nice endgame conversion here. Rook and bishop endgame. Set a little mating net. So I don't think we should put too much weight into this game because it was Armageddon, but it's still interesting to see that Jan chose e4 again and went for a Vienna to play for the win. That might give us some insight in what Jan does in the match when he needs to play for the win. In the final game, Jan having the white pieces. This is a classical event, Norway chess. Also played back in September. We see e4, e5, and a Joko piano with d4. These are more aggressive lines. So there's a little bit more theory to learn from the black side. In this game, I think Jan had a small edge in the middle game. He's got his bishop pair here, but he wasn't able to make anything out of it. Magnus played very solid. We get the same color bishop endgame. And here, actually, Magnus is starting to get an advantage after f3. The computer is saying with rook to b5, Magnus has an advantage. And I think this is a game that we will highlight in tomorrow's video. We're going to go over some of their most recent classical games, the Norway chess games, because I think we should go more in depth and talk about who was outplaying who when it came to a classical game. So that's the 16th game of our recap. Now let's talk a little bit about the scores of these players since the beginning of 2000. So this includes all of their online games, just seeing how well they do in the openings. And it's somewhere between like 350 and 550 games for each player. So a pretty big sample size with online play included. So since the start of 2020, Jan scores best with 1b3. It's his second most popular option. But the interesting thing is, he scores much better than any of the main lines. And I don't know if it's because it's a surprise weapon, but I think part of it is because Jan is a fighting player, and he can get fighting positions with 1b3 where maybe the other lines are so well prepared that they become drawish. So I think 1b3 should be a surprise weapon that Jan has ready, just to test the waters and see if Magnus is prepared for it. So not as a main weapon, but I think it's very interesting that Jan scores the best with 1b3. Another thing to note is Jan performs 40 points below his rating in the Sicilian. So after 1e4, I think Magnus will most likely play Sicilian as a main weapon. I don't know if he'll go Sveshnikov, but I think overall he has good results, and there's a very good chance he will play Sveshnikov, but he may unleash a different type of Sicilian that he has prepped for Jan. I think this is more likely than 1e5, because in the 1e5 games, Jan was getting some advantages early on, like in the early 2020 games that they played. So if e4 is played, I expect Sveshnikov or another type of Sicilian by Magnus. And let's see. Yeah, Jan scores 46 ELO above his rating, so he performs almost 50 points higher when he faces 1e5. So overall, Jan's very comfortable against e5, and I think that's something that Magnus needs to consider as well. There's a lot of positions that are close to equal, but Jan's able to kind of create these small middle game advantages and almost play in Magnus's style to outplay his opponent. So he can try to outplay Magnus from those comfortable small edges. I think Magnus is going to want a little bit more dynamic play in the Sicilian. Now, one nice thing to note, when looking at Magnus's games, nice to note from Jan's perspective, Magnus actually has been doing much worse against 1d4 than against 1e4. But Jan rarely plays d4. So I think that Magnus' team is going to be much more well prepared for 1e4, but I think Jan should consider d4. And the main weapon for Magnus has been to play kind of this Queen's Gambit decline setup. But there's a potential hole in Magnus's repertoire here, and it's the Catalan. And this is something that Vladimir Kramnik made popular in his match against Kasparov, and the Catalan has been popular ever since. But it kind of goes in and out of fashion in terms of if there's lines to press for a win, or if Black's able to equalize and play for the draw. One nice thing about playing the Catalan for Jan, it's unexpected. Another nice thing about playing the Catalan, Magnus doesn't score very well against it. Another nice thing about playing the Catalan is Jan is a Grunfeld expert, and this is sort of like a Grunfeld from the white side. So it's like a Grunfeld, but he's got an extra tempo. And one more note with the Catalan, Carlsen actually lost 5 games to only 2 games against Dubov in Blitz in the Catalan. So it was 5 wins for Dubov, 2 wins for Carlsen, and I think around 5 draws in a Blitz match that they played. And Nepomniachtchi is a stronger Blitz player than Dubov, you could argue. So I think if I'm Nepomniachtchi, I'm prepping the Catalan. I think that should be his main weapon with a fallback of 1b3. So thanks for watching this video. Reminder that we're going to have live coverage the first 3 days of the World Championship event. And I will put a link to the prediction video above. Make sure to check that out. And we also have a Black Friday sale, 40% off our opening courses, 60% off our study plans. That goes through Sunday. Check out the links in the description below. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we will see you on the live streams.